Welcome everybody. I'm actually going to read from my phone. I'm Sylvia. I'm Irving's youngest daughter. And I thought I would just let you know I'm a terrible crier, and I am not in any distress. I just cry at everything. So I may cry during my few little remarks. Don't pay any attention. I just thought it would be easier for me to let you know in advance. So welcome, and thank you all very much for coming. So I have been asked explicitly by Marilyn, and I have learned after many years not to disobey her commands, not to give individual introductions to the speakers, but rather to point out that the program notes is where you will find some very minimal speaker information, and they will tell you who they are when they appear here. You will not, however, find in those notes explicitly stated the fact about them that is most relevant for today. Everyone who has graciously agreed to speak on this occasion has been asked to do so because they each had a long and deep working relationship with Irving. And because for Irving, work was life, this is to say that they are here today because Irving loved and admired them with his usual gusto. I told you. I'm sorry. They have been asked to address the process in their work, since as one life ends, it is helpful to be reminded, even necessary to be reminded, that in fact work goes on, and there remains much work yet to do. Thank you very much for coming. Phyllis, please let me
out. I'm going to not talk about my own research, but I'm going to talk about the research at the Canadian Centre for Architecture. That is a new institution that was created in 1979 with a fundamental premise that architecture is a public concern. The specific aim of the founding was increasing public awareness of the role of architecture. There was a specific aim of increasing public awareness of the role of architecture and its history in contemporary society and promoting research in the field. So this is how we do it. Here's the building. Yeah, it's just quick. And this is the section of the building which, in a way, talks about how we do our research. The base has got the collections. Then the next story up is where that's below ground level, you can see. The next story up is where the research and curation and all those things you do in a museum, because it's a research center, but it's also a museum, are there as we take objects in and out and all that sort of stuff. And then also the piano nobile is where we present the result of the research. That is the exhibitions and the library and the bookstore and all that sort of stuff. The collection is extensive. About 100,000 drawings, prints and drawings, and 250,000 publications. I just want to give, this is a kind of new place, and lots of photography, and one of the interesting things are the full archives of architects in practice, and I guess some of them are no longer around. But then it's dealing with architecture and urban planning and landscape. There was a sort of general aspect of architecture. The collection, as I mentioned, has very, very many aspects of it, but they all are there to coalesce. We're not interested in a university kind of library where you have to cover everything, but in depth we work on various issues. And this is one of our earliest exhibitions that opened in 1989, I guess. And it was curated by Barry Bergdahl, and it's the Pantheon. the Saint-Geneviève, the Pantheon. Okay, we have drawings by, the drawings like that Agnes Mungan once pointed out to me years ago, and that was the sections of Soufflot's building, the expiatory chapel, and then there are the photograph on the right is by Marville, but the earliest photograph is from 1842 by Poitevin, and there are tons of photographs. There are 160 objects. If you want to go into our website and just put down Saint-Geneviève, the Pantheon. I guess that, but what was so interesting you have photographs, that's great, but we have these extraordinary collections of manuscripts by de Vailly, by Rode Fleury, Rondelet, and also the problems that existed in that building by I can't think of the name. Barry was working. I can't think of it. But anyway, I have notes, but I can't see it. But anyway, there was all these documents. They're about tons of them dealing with how to work with this problem of the heavy dome and the very light columns. And it was the first time columns were used in France in the neoclassical way. We also, this was an exhibition I did on 18th century, opening gates of 18th century mall, completely unknown in Montreal. They don't know their history. They do now, they're beginning to. But this was all based on a huge database we created from archives, basically in Quebec, but also documents in Aix-la-Provence and Ottawa, etc. And a search team. So, this kind of thing of looking at a broad subject and focusing on it. This is another kind of research we do, and we have done a lot of commissioning of photographs. This was a exhibition coming out of a huge archive we created with Robert Burley, Lee Friedlander, and Jeffrey James of the Parks of Olmsted. And so they went there at different times of the year, 4 times of the year, over on each of the four people went there so that you could, one gets the difference of the points of view and many other issues that involved. This is an installation of Peter Eisenman on the left, and that was the very first major archive that we acquired in our architectural archives. We don't have Frank's archive, but we have lots of others. And you'll see Frank in a minute. But we have major archives of on the right. Well, I guess that's not on this. Okay, this is Cedric Price, Matta Gordon Clark, Rossi, Aldo Rossi, and all of these, it was a type of exhibition we got out of the box. We just received them. Major scholars came to look at each of those. And we do these, we make the archives alive by various ways of presenting them. And of course, we've had exhibitions on each one of them except Matta Clark, and that's coming up in 3 different people to discuss Matta Clark's work. Then we have a whole series of issues of today. This was health. This is imperfect health, the medication of architecture, and it's made up of very many. Most of the exhibitions are done either by our in-house Mirko and Giardini, who is our director, and Giovanna Borassi, who is our head curator. And but then there are also, of course, they bring many other people into them. Then there's this was Jean-Louis Cohen, who's done lots of 3 exhibitions. He's doing a 4th one with us on Russia, America and Russia, that's coming up next year. This was Architect in Uniform, a building for the Second World War. It's just to give you some sort of sense of the kind of research that is done and the issues of bringing ideas forward to people. We don't try to teach them anything. We try to make them think. Oh yeah, and this is environment. Of course, we've had many exhibitions on that, and this one was on the Canadian. It was called. Goodness, I can't even think of the name of it. Oh yes, it's all happening. It's all happening so fast. Thank you, Sylvia. Designing and building for the second. A counter history of the modern Canadian environment. Everybody thinks Canada's so beautiful and all green. It's not so good. And so our exhibitions are always critical. We're never trying to say this is beautiful, this is wonderful. We're trying to say these are the issues that bring up. And this is one of 3 exhibitions we did on archaeology of the digital. And Greg Lynn was the curator of these. And we acquired the archives. Often in an exhibition like this, we will acquire the archives as we do the exhibition. And these I guess here you see some of Gary's investigations at that time. And then I'm just going very fast because I only have a little time. And these are the books published by the CCA. These are only in English. We have a whole lot of other ones that are bilingual, of course. And what I really want to say is that the digital is a hugely important aspect of the CCA. We're a little place in Montreal, sort of off the beaten track. And how do you get to the people? How do you bring ideas to them? And so our website and the work with archives of born in the machine digital design are hugely important. And so that we actually called our use of the digital our second building. And I don't know how many of you have looked at our website, but it's really quite extraordinary. It's not showing that you can go and see this and that, but it's really bringing up ideas, things to read, and it's a major kind of work in itself. And then we do have a Scholars in Residence program. We've had that from the beginning. Irving was the one who first worked on how we could set this up. Very important of being able to bring scholars to the tea table and discuss things. It's largely funded by the Mellon and by CCA itself. And recently it's changed a lot because we brought in special scholars, advanced scholars. Many of the people were very young and they needed a little bit of direction. And but recently we've a whole new program that we've been working with the Mellon Foundation in New York, where we put together a group. We make open calls for groups of scholars, and I'm thrilled about that because that's something I tried to initiate in the building. I never had any way of doing it, and so I think that I've just given you some kind of idea of how we do research at the CCA. And thank you very much for listening.
Marilyn asked me to identify myself very briefly. I am a disciple of Irving. Oscar Wilde said, "Life imitates art." George Bernard Shaw observed, "You use a glass mirror to see your face. You use works of art to see your soul." So what is art history? Well, nothing less than a humanistic branch of biology, the study of life, and of philosophy or theology, the study of the transcendental. Necessarily subjective, it yet demands scientific rigor in analysis and utmost perfection in translating it into words. No one better exemplified these qualities than Irving Lavin, who for me established the application of Occam's razor to art history, reduce the visual evidence to the clearest explanation. At a time when obscurity was valued over clarity, complexity over simplicity, I concluded that before Irving, my most valuable preparation for art history was freshman physics, which taught that the proof of a scientific theorem, its claim to truth, lies in the beauty of economy, explaining the most data in the least complicated way. Mies got it right. Less is more. Or, as Einstein said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. My first foray into art history happened a year before I took a course in it. I was writing a paper for freshman English analyzing a poem in Santa Maria del Popolo by Tom Gunn, Princeton's poet in residence. As I wrote, my father suddenly appeared with an art book. Maybe you'd like to see the painting your poem is about? It became my all-time favorite, Caravaggio's Conversion of Paul. The figure, as we see, lies prostrate, eyes closed. Everything happens within, as Saul is converted into the Apostle Paul. His gesture is the sole sign of his state of soul. The poet's large gesture of solitary man resisting by embracing nothingness. Well, if in this first instance a timely illustration illuminated a poem, the relationship between text and image was soon reversed. More often, the very act of writing leads to questions and, if I'm lucky, answers I am unaware of before putting pen to paper. It's what my father called the heuristic power of writing. He explained that ideas are like suitcases, hard to pick up unless one uses the handle. It is the writer's task to provide that handle for the reader. Mark Twain said, "The difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug." Irving never settled for the bug. I recently had to revise my Bernini book after Irving's authentication of Bernini's rediscovered Salvator Mundi in Rome. As I struggled to find the right words, a question popped up. What is the primary, simplest meaning of Christ's perplexing gesture? The playwright Hugo von Hofmannsthal wrote, "Die Tiefe muss man verstecken. Wo? An der Oberfläche. Depth must be concealed. Where? On the surface." Bernini's surface always makes sense. His son Domenico, who was present at the creation, described the gesture as if in the act of blessing. And if we take him at his word, then in the spirit of Occam's razor, the answer is obvious. Bernini has captured in stone the act of blessing. He left as his parting tour de force the Savior caught at the moment he is about to complete the horizontal sweep of the cruciform blessing, a gesture familiar to any Catholic. In the end, it's all about movement, Bernini's hallmark. My final heuristic moment came while composing a long postponed, for 40 years, article on Bernini's Cristo Vivo Crucifix. Once again, in the midst of writing, I asked myself, why did he make it? Why, after 3/4 of the crucifixes for St. Peter's were cast, all representing the Cristo Morto, the dead Christ, did he decide to design a second version, the living Christ? Well, as I was describing the dynamic S-curve in the related sculpture of Daniel, the piece fell into place. Daniel in the lion's den was a traditional prefiguration of the resurrected Christ, triumphant over death just as the prophet had survived the lions. Bernini's revised crucifix expresses not only the expiring figure on the cross, but also proleptically, a term I owe to Irving, the resurrected Christ. He wanted to conclude his sequence of 25 altar crucifixes not in B minor, but B major. The practice of art history, I submit, owes as much to the discipline of writing as to looking. The written word is itself a medium of chiaroscuro, drawing shadows into light.
I'm just going to show buildings and how I got there, and hope that's what you wanted to hear. This is a tower in New York, and I did this drawing, and I was interested in Bernini's curves as compared to Michelangelo's curves. And I learned that from the guy we're honoring, who I love dearly. Anyway, we did a lot of models. That's how I work, searching, looking, blah, blah, blah. And I asked an assistant who graduated Princeton if she knew the difference between Michelangelo curves and Bernini curves, and she said yes. And I asked her to make this model, which she did. To build it, how do you build something like that? We studied a 3D model, using a 3D model. We evaluate the cost. It's repeated until the design and budget are aligned, so it's all about cost, because if you don't, you won't get it built. And the curtain wall that you saw is turned out built at the same price as a flat curtain wall in New York City at the same time, so it doesn't have to be more expensive. These are the mock-ups. This is the building. Those curves are bay windows. And this is the process of computer analysis, which picks out all the flat surfaces and then adds the curves. This is the computer photograph, and then this is the reality. And I was interested in making a relationship with the Woolworth building behind. It has the stepped facade, and I used the steps. And we didn't put a cap on it out of respect for the Woolworth building. And the Bernini curves are at the same scale as the terracotta decoration on the Woolworth building. And the gods shined on us. And they shined on us twice, because the building on the left is also in the middle between those two, is also one of my buildings. So I thought I'd reached nirvana. This is the Walt Disney Concert Hall. I start with crazy sketches and I do a lot of them. This is just one of them. And that's the building. The client was Mrs. Disney, Walt's widow, and she liked buildings that looked like little cottages with thatched roofs and ducky ponds. It was very hard to convince her about this. At one point, she tried to stop it. I told her I was building a flower, and I've actually flown over it, and from the top, it does look like a flower. This is the site, the top piece. This is the context. So the middle one is the Shirin Concert Hall in Berlin, which was the newest concert hall, and everybody was all excited about that because it made the audience very important and created a relationship between audience and orchestra that hadn't been done. The acoustician was still alive. I met with him, and our acoustician was a student of that guy. And so we had lunch, and our acoustician, I asked him which model, and the German guy said this one, the one in the middle, and our acoustician, who's from Japan, said the one on the left, and I think a food fight ensued at the Kempinski, but I can't remember. The director of the Philharmonic and I took a tour, and I fell in love with the one on the right, which is the Concertgebouw, and built from that. We studied every conceivable possibility. And ended up here. So it's about the same width as Concertgebouw. And the intention for us was to create a relationship between audience and performer, and audience, so that it was a communal effort, and you felt that, and it worked. It has worked. These are the models we make. They're pretty, and this model was then made at 1:10 scale and tested by the acoustician. Every seat was tested. It was a new process. These are the study models up to that, to the exterior of it, in their context. And that's the completed model, which the contractor who was on the board of directors of the Philharmonic said could never be built. We built it. I haven't seen him. What happened? Am I through? Oh, that's it under construction. It was built for a reasonable budget. We hit their budget number. The additional costs were due to board members' interference and the contractor on the board who interfered and made mistakes and cost them money, which is, every time I go to a cultural project and go to the board meeting, there's always a contractor there or a builder guy, and they all know better, and they end up costing the project more money. This was built on budget. The additional costs were related to them, and that's been proven. I'm not bragging, that's the facts. The organ is another story which would take too long to talk about. I was told it was impossible, never be built, would never work, but it did. This is Berlin. I love doing concert halls. I love classical music. I love being part of it. It's kind of interesting. From my age now, that's what I like to do most. This is in Berlin. This is the Staatsoper warehouse for Staatsoper sets. Daniel Barenboim and Edward Said started a program called the Divan Orchestra with Israelis, Palestinians, etc. And I became interested in that idea and met with the kids and traveled with them and got very interested in, because I always believed speaking to each other through the arts is probably the only way we really understand each other. But in this left corner, there was to be built a small concert hall, 700 seats. And my first drawing was an oval, which I shared with Irving Lavin, who immediately, and this is the model of it. And Irving called me and said, do you remember the ceiling of San Carlino? It's an oval. And I said, yes. And so it fit in, and Irving explained to me that Bernini had the same problem I had, that he had the two streets on the corner, a building on the right next to him and a building behind him, which was a monastery, and he was hemmed in, and he made an oval. And I had a building already built, and I couldn't do anything, And I couldn't make a circle, because if you made a circle, it would sit in the center. It wouldn't have, you'd be wasting space, so made an oval. So for the same reason, at least that's what Professor Lavin told me, and I believe it. So you can see the blue are the windows of the existing building. And it's used for many kinds of, there's 3 pianos, 3 harps. It was for Pierre Boulez. The hall was named after Pierre. There's Daniel Bermond. And the latest one is a small concert hall, which is in a school. We're doing the Colburn School of Music, which is just down the hill from the Walt Disney Concert Hall. I'm showing this to show you the number of models made, and there's more on just on every project, and studying skin and everything, every part of it. This is the urban design. So the gray is Disney Hall, and the white down the hill to the right is the new project. And that was the fantasy, is how do you make a concert hall? How do you make a building that's for students, for a college of music? And the difference is the College of Music, is the kids are there 24/7, and so the idea was to give it transparency. And so that's where we started. And this is kind of where we're going. The concert hall is inside. The glass is, there are holes in the buildings that open into the concert hall. This is the plan. And the balcony from the Berlin Hall, which the acoustician, when we did it in Berlin, said it won't work, finally agreed that it worked. Now he insists on having it everywhere. So this is 1,100 seats, and it'll be very intimate. And you can see the window. There's windows on all sides, and there's skylights. And this is the final design. With the foyers, the red. There's another theater to the right for dance and opera. And the space between the glass is part of the exiting from for people coming to the concerts, come through that space, as well as they use, the students can use that for a lot of things. It can become a living facade at sometimes, which they love to do. They love to pile all over the buildings and do things. So this is giving them space. Finally, in Arles, a Roman city, the little round dot at the bottom of the screen is my client. It's an art center. It's Maya Huffman is the client, and she has a foundation for photography and arts, and she wanted a building on that site. You can see my building to the left of the red roof on the main street, and I made a drum around the bottom of it, which is hard to see here, that relates to the Roman, which is the foyer, and it relates to the Roman. This is my first sketch of the project. And there's the drum and the building. And they are just offices and studios for artists and library and things like that. And there's the cafes and the uses inside keep changing. So in the end, I don't have a clue what's going to be. It has something to do with the arts. That's all I know. These are the study models, endless study models. These are only 1/10 of them. There's the building under construction. And we were searching for, we use the light to bring in, to use it inside, to enjoy and so on, and to articulate the spaces. But I've been always wanting to find it on the building, find it. How do you find it? There must be, it's very rich. How do you get all the colors and all the seasons and all the things and express it? How can you get the building to express it? So this was a study to do that. We used stainless steel, and they're these small blocks. They become the facade. They're a rain screen, and they're placed all over the building at different angles. And so during the day, all day long, the facade changes. Now it's all silver, it's all stainless steel, so these colors come from God or somebody. This is in one day, you're going to see it. Now this is the city where Van Gogh painted Starry Night, so I was looking for him. Whoops, and I found him. Thank you.
My name is Jack Freiberg, and I'm an art historian thanks to Irving Lavin. What is art history and how do you do it? This is an important question, especially here at the Institute for Advanced Study, which has brought in generations of young scholars to interact with other people in the humanities and sciences, and thereby expand their vision of what art history and intellectual pursuit might be, in advanced study. And also to honor Irving, who was deeply and passionately interested in defining what he was all about as an art historian. And he actually wrote about it in what I like to think of as a manifesto, published first in 1983 with the provocative title, The Art of Art History. In it, he defines 5 principles that guided his work, and I think it's useful to repeat them here because, in part, they also guided mine. Anything man-made is a work of art. Everything in a work of art was intended by its creator. Every work of art is a self-contained whole. Every work of art is an absolute statement. Every work of art is a unique statement. I like to think of those principles, which he explicates in this piece, as guidelines for how a history of art in 1983, and then it was published many times thereafter and given as speeches, how it could define a kind of an open approach to art history without restrictions, a democracy of art history, as I like to think of it. So I want to address how I absorbed those lessons in a current project that brought me back to dissertation days when I was studying the late 16th century renovations at the Cathedral of Rome, San Giovanni in Laterano, that you see here in Piranesi's rendering. I had no intention of ever returning to that subject. But when I received an invitation to contribute an essay to a volume devoted to coffered wooden ceilings in Roman churches, I seized the opportunity, knowing that there would be more to be found than I had originally thought. I thought initially that maybe it would have been an easy project to just consult my original yellowing dissertation notes and quickly write the piece, but soon became clear that I needed to start from the beginning by questioning what we know, returning to the fundamentals, digging through the archival record, tracking the visual evidence, looking again and again. I was sustained in that effort by an abiding faith that with hard work and a dash of inspiration, works of art would yield their intellectual secrets to me, just as they had for Irving. Visitors entering the nave of San Giovanni in Laterano encounter one of the most spectacular coffered wooden ceilings to be seen in Rome. The work was commissioned by Pope Pius IV, who shortly after his election to the papacy in 1559 visited the Lateran and announced a comprehensive project to restore the venerable basilica, Rome's cathedral and the Pope's own church in his office as Bishop of Rome, founded by Constantine the Great and honored as Caput et Mater, head and mother of all churches of the city of Rome and of the world. How did Pius IV's ceiling honor that august heritage is the question that I sought to answer. We know quite a bit about the ceiling from the documentary evidence, but not the artist who designed it. Every work of art every man-made object is a work of art. Ringing in my ear, I put aside those questions. One might think about the master carpenters, for example, the technicians, the engineers. The ceiling actually hangs from hidden supports in the space between the ceiling and the roof. The Lateran ceiling is organized around three monumental coats of arms notable for their size and eye-popping presentation, set within an oval that echoes the curved shield of the arms, overlaid with gold and with the ground brilliantly polychromed. The arms of the patron, Pius IV, remain in their original position at the center, but the others were changed over time. As the documents attest, in the original program, the arms of the Senate and people of Rome were located in the compartment toward the altar, that is at the bottom of the slide, and the arms of the Lateran Basilica toward the nave entrance at the top of the slide. When coats of arms of people or institutions appear in works of art, they signal the patron's responsibility for the commission. And this is also true of the Lateran, as it was for earlier church ceilings in Rome. But over time, I came to understand that those coats of arms were not simply included as a way to claim credit for the work, they were that too, but they were the main subject. This realization led to another, that the ceiling at the Lateran set forth a diagram of institutional authority that centered on the office of the Pope and his powers in both the temporal and spiritual realms. In other words, it was a visual counterpart to a legal and theological argument. The more you see, the more information you have to interpret. I started by examining the reliefs that frame the principal armorial fields, but the multiplicity of objects and their stunning visual presentation made it difficult to discern how the scheme was organized. And so I enlisted expert help, something I learned from Irving. Here you see the first stab at inventorying those objects, sketched by my friend Franco. I'm a crier too. As we stood gazing up at that golden firmament, which I had done with Irving. With this sketch in hand, I realized that the objects depicted all concerned the unique history of the Lateran. For example, the vessels and other appurtenances employed in the Mass that are concentrated at the two ends of the ceiling refer to Constantine's original endowment with the liturgical vessels to this church, and more broadly to the belief that the Lateran was the first permanent church established in accordance with ecclesiastical law, where the faithful could congregate and receive the sacraments, hence the vessels. Armed with the realization that the ceiling program was site-specific to the Lateran, I began to see how the entire program was structured to follow the protocols governing the display of coats of arms, banners, and other insignia, the art of heraldry. Reinforcing the pivotal position of the arms of Pius IV in the ceiling's program are the four L-shaped coffers at the corners with images referring to Saints Peter and Paul above and to the instruments of Christ's Passion below. The busts of Peter and Paul point to the presence of their head relics located in the upper level of the high altar triborium. Where they draw the attention of the faithful in splendid reliquaries composed of gold, silver, and gems. And here's detail of that with an engraving of the head reliquaries in the main altar. In a significant break with tradition, the images on the ceiling reverse the position of the reliquaries at the high altar that respects a long-standing tradition of placing Paul on our left and Peter on our right. For example, on early Christian sarcophagi, papal seals, and in the mosaic adorning the old St. Peter's Basilica. What might explain the reversal of their positions on the ceiling? When I discovered the source of the left-right reversal in an early legal text, I knew I was on the right track. And here, just to be clear about what I'm talking about, Peter on the left in the ceiling is actually on our right in the high altar and those other examples I cited. The opportunity to reevaluate how Peter and Paul should be positioned relative to each other and to Christ, and more generally how sacred directions should be determined, whether from the viewer's position as in antiquity or from the opposite side, was the subject of discussion from the Middle Ages on. Among the texts considered in the Renaissance was the treatise by the famed jurist Bartolo da Sassoferrato, who died in 1357, the first to discuss legal issues pertaining to coats of arms and other insignia. Bartolo, referring to the origins of heraldry and military culture, asserted that the important elements of the arms be positioned on the right as determined by the person holding the shield, not the viewer. That procedure for identifying dexter and sinistra was subsequently adopted for liturgical contexts with respect to Christ on the altar cross. Time is short, so I must move quickly here in reaching my conclusions, the most difficult and also the most rewarding stage of the process I am describing. First, the symbols of institutional and divine authority that adorn the ceiling and their heraldic organization underscore their affiliation with the law to which heraldry was closely allied. I would have stopped there, but Irving's admonition. And then what? Second, the heraldic underpinnings of the ceiling recalls the origin of the Lateran in the patronage of Constantine, who first ceded the symbols of imperial power to the Pope. And third, just as heraldry was grounded in military culture, the ceiling reflects the militancy of the Counter-Reformation Church. In the end, the nave ceiling of Pope Pius IV advances legal and theological arguments supporting the basilica's primacy, the authenticity of Constantine's donation, and the charge to disseminate human salvation worldwide. Gazing up at the ceiling with this new appreciation, we see a vision of the triumphant church that Constantine first beheld in the heavens on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. This is a great deal of meaning that I am associating with a work of carpentry with those principles that Irving set forth in the manifesto, helping me along the way. Thank you.
As you can see, my name is David Levine. Irving was my mentor, my teacher for 44 years. It meant everything to me. And I'll be talking more about that this afternoon. My main field of study is Dutch painting, and particularly Dutch genre painting. What I do is mostly close readings of individual works of art, individual Dutch genre paintings. And in these studies, I try to apply the full set of tools of art history to these pictures, pictures that have not always received that treatment. Irving encouraged me in that regard. I would say my work tends to be more speculative and provocative than authoritative in all respects. I think I'm interested in asking questions. I'm more interested in questions than in coming to final answers on things. I like looking at things from new angles and challenging old assumptions. And I hope that my scholarly work makes my readers and listeners think about my subject in ways that they've not previously considered, even if they don't agree with every word that I utter. And I want to thank Irving for encouraging me in this direction. He never said, "David, reel it in." He always said, go further, and of course, do it better. Actually, he didn't say do it better. I just felt from him I should do it better. To give you an idea of how I do art history, I thought I might describe my way of investigating this picture, a canvas by the Harlem painter, or a Harlem painter by the name of Jan Mintz Molenaar. The painting is called Boys with Dwarves. It is now on view at the Boymans van Beuningen Museum in Rotterdam, and I apologize to Marilyn, who's heard me talk about this painting before. I've worked on this painting on and off for years, lectured about it, and recently published a paper on it. It's not my intention to present my whole argument here to you today. I just want to briefly describe a portion of my mental process as I conducted my investigation, in keeping with the way I understood what we're doing here today. Boys with Dwarves provides its viewers with a fascinating interpretive puzzle. Signed and dated 1646 and measuring an impressive 1.25 meters in width, the canvas portrays men and women gathered outside a country tavern, watching an enraged dwarf rearing back to hurl an object in the direction of 3 fleeing boys. These arrows point out the protagonists in case you're having trouble finding them in this mess of figures. The desperate body language and facial expressions of the youths suggest that the little man means business. Indeed, the pained grimace of the downed fellow on the far left indicates that the dwarf has already hit his mark on a previous heave. The onlookers arranged behind the antagonists respond variously to the uproar. One man laughs and jumps about maniacally. Other figures, including a second dwarf, a young woman, gaze upon the scene with relative calm. An elegantly attired gentleman, to which a young lady to his rear seems attached, smiles indulgently in the direction of the little people, while gesturing towards the confrontation. 2 men in the background point their fingers upward as though recognizing some deeper significance in the episode. But what could that possibly be? In attempting to answer that vexing question, which I thought probably eluded other scholars who worked on this painting, I focused my attention first on the extraordinary poses of the chief protagonists, the 3 fleeing boys and the dwarf. Their poses are extraordinarily powerful, varied, and violent. Indeed, they seem to me to be more appropriate to a battle painting than a genre scene. Then it struck me that the poses might actually have been designed in emulation of ancient Greco-Roman representations of warriors or other classicizing noble combatants, put here in this context. I got to work to see whether that could possibly be so, consulting indices and books that cataloged ancient sculptures and finding out which ones of them were known during the period. making comparisons between those objects and my image. And this is what I've come up with. This is what I came up with. One of the boys resembles the Vatican's so-called kneeling Persian, a half-size Roman copy of a Pergamene original that once formed part of a frieze on the Athenian Acropolis. The diminutive marble represents a nearly nude warrior fallen to the ground in a protective crouch, his limbs arranged in windmill fashion around his sharply twisting torso and head. Replicated in prints, the pose was evidently known in the Netherlands from the early 16th century on. It's reflected in paintings, other paintings. Molinar seems to have adapted its most crucial features, such as the awkward bend of the torso over the widely splayed legs, the sharp twist of the head toward the attacker, the arm raised protectively over the head, and perhaps even the oddly truncated neck. Another one of the boys resembles the so-called wounded Gaul today in the Louvre. This small marble, representing a suffering warrior resting upon one knee while bracing himself on an extended leg, probably hails from the same series as the Vatican kneeling Persian. From this figure, which was also known to Netherlandish painters early on, Molinar seems to have adapted essential features of the boy's pose, such as the strange asymmetrical positioning of the legs, one knee up, the other down, and extended left arm with closed fist. The sculpture may even have inspired the boy's grimacing facial expression. The pose of Molinar's third boy recalls forms featured in noble Italian art of the more recent past. Titian used the type to picture the bolting friar featured in the foreground of his Death of St. Peter Martyr. And Caravaggio used a similar pose to portray the terrified fleeing youth in his Martyrdom of St. Matthew in the Contarelli Chapel. Molinar's stone-throwing dwarf also has an ancient iconographic model, one known from Roman bronze miniatures, such as this figurine in Baltimore, and Greek vase paintings. The furious man's stubby proportions, off-balance gait, and fierce facial expression imitate those of his comically lewd Greco-Roman warrior ancestors. Well, what should we make of all this? It's a long story. I will just say that these elements and others of a similar nature gave me reason to hypothesize that Boys with Dwarfs is actually a contrived, even an ironic image, the deeper significance of which probably lies well below its surface. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. My name is Horst Bredekamp. I'm actually professor of art history in Berlin, Humboldt University. But what connects me with Irving, Lavin is more my professorship in Hamburg, which I started with in 1982. And I will talk about this more lengthily in the afternoon. In this morning session where we were asked to talk about what we are doing in this very moment, I would stick more to a methodological approach, which I in a kind learned from Irving, or which he supported continuously. and that is his free spirit, Freigeist. I do not know how one can translate that, his freely willing attitude. What comes next? This question that we heard. The limitness of his approach in thinking and in fields. That's what I will talk about in this moment now. In my preface to the English translation of a book in which I tried to sketch major problems of my studies, I published a black and white photograph from a newspaper of the year 1975 that I encountered during my PhD, working on iconoclasm. It shows a Cambodian soldier sitting with a rifle in his hands, besides him the picture of a Buddhist idol. The parallel between weapon and picture struck me like an eureka moment. Ever since, I have considered images as being equal in power to weapons. Pictures never illustrate, they do something. Pictures aren't reactions, but instead, they construct what they show. They possess an active power that seemingly is akin to living entities. This phenomenon has been expressed by the first-person singular connected to artifacts in almost every culture at all times. The best example might be Jan van Eyck's portrait of a man in a red turban or cloth, possibly a self-portrait of the painter, which he accompanied with an inscription on the frame, lower frame. Jan van Eyck made me, me fecit, made me, first person singular. The image lives. The image is more than the constructivistic perception of the beholder. This active latency of images has recently been tested by psychologists, confirming in, as I said, psychological terms, what I've tried to coin in the term Bildakt, image acts. This is to be observed in every shaped form, as Leon Battista Alberti defined it around 1435. He named every piece of nature that received a minimum of human investment or intervention, a simulacrum, a picture. According to his definition, this Chinese stone cloud from the 17th century seemingly is a piece of nature, but in effect it has become an object of art. In principle, as Alberti defined it, there is no limit as to where art history stretches out. Irving and I talked endlessly about this tradition in which the split between art history and visual studies is rather superficial. And behind this, of course, is the tradition of the Warburg School, which was brought out in Hamburg till the emigration in the year 1933. The frame of art history as Bildwissenschaft, image science, encompasses the fields of politics, warfare, medicine, and the natural sciences. I have tried to define image acts playing out their intrinsic power in Thomas Hobbes's and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz's concepts and visualizations, as well as Galileo Galilei's and Charles Darwin's drawings. And don't be afraid, in this moment I teach Michelangelo. But as for Darwin, I became deeply interested in Darwin's diagrams of evolution that at first were inspired by a coral. It isn't a coral, but he did not know that at that time. By a coral he found in the Pacific and brought to London. At first he thought of the general symbol of evolution not in the form of the well-known tree of evolution, but that of a coral of evolution. The value and the meaning of this little piece, about which I wrote an entire book, cannot be overstressed. It was only through the pressure of Alfred Russel Wallace that Darwin switched from the image of the coral to the image of the tree as a visual symbol of the evolution, and thus opened his flanks towards the so-called survival of the fittest, which is a term of Herbert Spencer, later famously misused by both Stalin and Hitler. Would Darwin have stuck to the coral because the dark side of the concept of evolution might have never appeared in this way? Following this conception of art history as an approach to pictures in the most broadest sense, I, together with my colleague Wolfgang Schäffner, stepped into a kind of race for one of the so-called clusters of excellence, which the German Ministry of Research invented in order to strengthen fundamental research not only in the Max Planck Institutes, but also within the framework of the universities. We succeeded with our cluster under the title Bild, Wissen, Gestaltung, Image, Knowledge, Gestaltung. The last German word, Gestaltung, can hardly be translated adequately into English, and that's why we kept image, knowledge, Gestaltung. It means the shaping of forms, which in order to provide them with a Gestalt, which is more than pure form, but encapsulates an intrinsic energeia. We were able to bring together more than 40 disciplines, from medicine to science, design, and all fields of the humanities, in order to think about the constructive power of pictures in all possible and impossible areas. This cluster attracted ever more scientists and people from medicine, so that we were inspired to run also last year's competition, now under the title Matters of Activity, Image, Space, Material, enlarging the problem of the active images to the fields of active spaces and active materials. A famous example is the pine cone, which, after having been separated from the tree, seems to petrify in a rather short time. Seemingly, life has left its corpus. But why, when the atmosphere becomes wet or when the temperatures alter, does the pine cone start to move again? This could be explained up to a high level by physical and chemical conditions and reactions. But up to now, not all reactions can be explained. Thus, we talk about a system of codes and structures in which the material as such stays latently active, even when it is almost completely separated from external influences. It seems as if the radical separation between living and dead material cannot be upheld anymore in a radically decisive way. The structural latency to act is what we call active matter. No less important, among a lot of other examples, are the bacterial microfilms. Myriads of bacteria shape architectures in the tiniest spaces with an impressive intelligence through geometrical lines and ribs. The difference in height and of these architectures between a singular bacterium is like one between a human being and the tower of a cathedral. As it sometimes happens, the visual art is faster than the scientific speed. Architects like Achim Menges and others in Stuttgart are shaping meteorosensitive pavilions that are reflecting atmospheric changes with a power that, in the vision of these architects, might help in solving energy problems in the upcoming 20 years. This is the long way that art history as image science, Bildwissenschaft, has taken. Our current cluster is headed by 2 professors from the humanities, but more than half of the researchers come from the natural sciences, which are obviously happy to have playfields of ground research in which they can follow their own internal active matters. As I said, on all of these questions, I have had continuous talks, exchanges of ideas and advice with Irving when we met or on the phone. 1 week ago, my book on Galileo's thinking head came out in English after some troubles. Here is what mainly in this book is also encapsulated what I talked about in this frame with Irving, mainly on Claude Melon's interest in the moon, which brought us into an intensive discussion through which my book profited in general. The book had already gone into print when I was confronted with Irving's death. But I could, in the last moment, beyond my acknowledgement, still dedicate it to him. This is my contribution of art history as image science to Irving, who has always supported this German and Jewish conception of art history, which went into exile in 1933, and which we try to restore and establish each day. And I have the first pre-book for Marilyn.
In good art historical fashion, everybody spoke too long, and wonderfully, but too long. We're just, maybe rather than have a full-fledged panel discussion, we'll just see if the speakers have any questions for each other, or if there are any questions from the floor. And please tell your digestive systems that this will only be a few minutes, and then we'll break for lunch very soon. But if there's a question from the floor for each other. I don't know.
Does this work? Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
it
there
does.
you go.
Okay, look, I, in a different life, used to edit murder mysteries. And so I have to ask my colleague and fellow graduate student and friend David, I need to know the Agatha Christie ending to his mystery.
Thanks, Charlie. Charles, I don't think that I can give an adequate answer to the question right now fully, but I can say that when these classicizations are applied to high subject matter, we can understand them as serious lauds of the subject. When they're applied to subject matter that is clearly ignoble, clearly not good behavior, we have to understand them in a very different way, very different light. And recognize that they can turn our attention to other matters that go beyond the ostensible subject matter of the painting. In this case, I have tried to make parallels with the certain literary forms that were popular in the Renaissance in the 17th century, such as the ironic encomium, something that was of great interest to Irving and that Irving told me all about and encouraged me to work on in relation to this kind of image. In those ironic encomia, classical forms are applied to often very low and ignoble subject matter in order to function in a variety of ways. Sometimes they praise the writer, sometimes they do other things, but the basic idea is that they overturn common assumptions and wisdom about the objects or about the subjects that are represented. And I think in some respect that's happening here. But I'm going to stop because I don't want to dominate the discussion.
We're going to keep reading.
Okay.
I know it's a little bit late, but whose ever mail bong keeps going off, could you please turn your computer off so that it doesn't happen again? Thank you very much. Frank, did you want to say something? No, you didn't want to say something. I thought maybe I would make an observation. I'm not sure it's an observation. Perhaps it's a question or perhaps it's an observation rather than a question, but thinking about what Horst said about doing this here at the Institute, it's hard not to think of Panofsky, and it's hard not to think of the radiator cap behind a lot of what you have said collectively about Irving. And I'm sure many of you here are friends, have been to the house and know the famous corner in the house with the Bernini below and the toasters above. So I suppose that what I wanted to ask is about the role of machines, which is not something that, as far as I know, Irving wrote about, but he certainly collected. But there is a kind of mechanical system, a newly emerging mechanical digital apparatus that some of you write explicitly about, some of you use, some of you have built into your foundations deeply and provocatively. So I suppose my general question would be, if anyone here has anything to say about digital tools in the making of art history. Everybody showed a PowerPoint. David, I loved seeing your notes, because I have to say I haven't figured out how to go from PowerPoint to notes and quite how to do that. But anyway, digital tools in the production of the work that you do today. Irving is somebody who lived the life from the analog to the digital. And I wonder whether that might be something anybody had a comment about that might give us something to talk about for a minute or two before we eat an analog lunch.
Well, I want to just mention that in terms of the work that we do at the CCA. Not only do we work with the archives of architects who are born in the, not using digital as a copy stuff, but it's born in the machine digital, which is absolutely fascinating. And it's been very complicated to sort of get back to the original objects, which are no longer, you can't use the techniques that they used at that time, you have to develop new ones. But I think that the question of using it on the websites is just amazing in terms of what you could do. Not the boring old things that everybody does on websites about museums, which just as I go here, go there. But one can really use it as a tool for transmitting and developing argumentation. You can go back and forth, which we've done at various times, to other places. And so it becomes a tool of really expanding information in a way that one could not have done that before.
Horst, did you want to?
Well, you have something to say about that? Yeah.
Well, just we use a lot of digital stuff, and we found it very exciting and helpful. The construction industry, for some reason, has been slow to really take it on and take it somewhere. And it's obvious that in time, with the visualization, HoloLens, and all these things where you can put a glass on and see everything from a drawing in 3 dimensions and so on. I only look at what's happened to Zuckerberg and that negative response, and I'm wondering, should we keep the devil in the box? I'm 90, so I can say this, but I wonder where we're going. I suppose there'll always be somebody with talent, with integrity, who will use the equipment and hopefully do something with it. I mean, history says that will happen. So I'm counting on that.
But Frank, you've done work in the buildings that you could not have done without the digital tools.
Right. That's true.
Well, that's a huge difference.
I know. But then what happens in outer space? Maybe.
Well, okay, that's another question.
Horst,
Yeah, I
please.
would just underline what was the essence of your question, that there is a tradition in the Hamburg Vienna school around 1900, Alois Riegel, one of the teacher of Walter Benjamin, as he always declared, and in the Hamburgian tradition of the Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek Warburg, where the art historians, together with people from other disciplines, talked about the latest developments in the technical area, arguing about mass media, Warburg, about stems, about publications, daily publications, etc., and on Raphael and Michelangelo. And that is the frame which Panofsky a bit left behind when he came to Princeton, but still stuck to it. He researched on Renaissance mathematics. He had best friends in natural sciences, not only Einstein, but Wolfgang Pauli, whom he knew from Hamburg. They were friends already in Hamburg. And there is a letter I think from 34, where he writes to Pauli, the director of the Kunsthalle in Hamburg, as ever, my best friends come from the natural sciences. Already again, yeah. And this one might transform to our times and what we have to learn, who is we. But what is so essential, that the Manichaeistic distinction between digital and analog should be overcome. And that is the lesson from the Hamburgian tradition. I had the great honor to write the introduction to Frank's book, to the book of Frank's drawings, Gary Draws. And I witnessed for, I think, one whole week how you draw continuously. Always, this right hand is continuously drawing. Then models are being done. Then they are put under a camera, and in digital mode, something comes out, is put on the table. Then again, the process through the hand. And to finish up to the greatest surprise that two humanists won another Excellence of Cluster last year. That depended on one sentence with which we started, and then developed it in these applications are little books. This sentence was, the greatest event of 21st century is the return of the analog in the digital age. The return of the analog in the digital age. We are in the digital age. But to let go the analog would be absurd and manichaeistic in the most radical way. It's both. And that is the lesson which we can get, as I said, from the whole tradition in which Irving worked. The radiator.
Thank you very much. Thank you.